Thank you for joining us for the Public Narrative Podcast. I'm your host, Jhmira Alexander, and I'm joined here with Kartemquin Films Executive Director Betsy Leonard.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Tell us a little bit about yourself, like a little bit about your journey, how you found yourself at Kartemquin.
Okay. So I am a 57-year-old white woman who is a transplant to Chicago. I am at my core somebody who has always found deep curiosity in people. I'm very energized by people and their stories, but I have often experienced in my lifetime a lot of feeling sort of like as an outsider. I moved around a lot as a kid, and I think that outsider experience led me to always want to try to find meaningful ways to connect with people. And I learned early on that I couldn't really trust more superficial kind of interactions. So I think throughout life, I looked for ways that I could find moments of belonging. And fast forward, I moved to Chicago in 1990. I originally started working in human rights and anti-poverty work because I think as a newcomer to a city this size, it was a little overwhelming to me to be, a resident in a place where there was such incredible, poverty and inequity of resources, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I channeled it into my work. I would say, how did I end up as the executive director of Kartemquin after doing anti-poverty work for almost 3 decades? It really stemmed from time that I spent, as I said earlier, getting to know people and their stories, and that's what my work allowed me to do. And in 2018, I had the opportunity to participate in a restorative justice training for trainers with the staff of Ready Chicago, a anti-gun violence program that was run at the time by is being run by Heartland Alliance. And that experience of story hearing, not only storytelling, was really complementary to work I'd been doing with a program called Heal Chicago, which really looks at how do we hold space for someone else to tell their story, not for empathy, conversation, or understanding, but by holding space, a person has the moment to make meaning of their story, and by making meaning of our story, we heal from our trauma, we experience our own meaning making that allows us to move forward. So those experiences were really impactful for me to realize that there's power in telling stories, there's power in hearing stories, and there's power in making space for other people to tell their stories. And as is often the case, an opportunity came my way to take the experience I had in management and leadership and nonprofit administration and apply it to this independent documentary organization that, for 57 years has been telling stories that really try to bring people, our mission is about engaging people, engaging democracy through documentary.
I absolutely love documentaries, and I love them particularly because it usually teaches me something that I didn't know about an issue that I thought I knew.
Mm-hmm.
And within the storytelling, it's like it challenges us to think differently, not just about the issue, but about the solutions. And that's the thing that I lift out of any documentary that I watch, be it something that might be issue based or it might be centered around a particular person. Is there a documentary that like you absolutely love and could recommend?
There's so many, but along the lines of a story that was not my story, but that I got insight into. The story Unapologetic, which came out in 2021 during the pandemic, tells the story of Black queer feminist women who were, leading moments in the Black Lives Matter movement. And Ashley O'Shea, the director, had in an interview said, I wasn't able to use a lot of archival footage in this film because the camera wasn't trained on these women. they've been part of these struggles for, hundreds and hundreds of years. And that was a moment where not only the film itself, gave me proximity to a story that's not my story, that expanded my understanding, but it was also like the interview with the director herself to say, this is also what's like there's a structural problem that's not told about the story that's around this film. And that was also, it was that both and, I love the story. I loved the proximity it gave me to two protagonists' lives that's not my own, but also the challenge that the director gave me about, or not just me, but us, about what does it mean to capture truth on film and for whom and why, I will also say there's something you said really interesting about, stories help me have greater understanding about things in deeper, nuanced ways. I shared that thought in a recent meeting we had with a group of individuals who we had hired to be part of a review panel for, we have a grant award for AAPI filmmakers. And so we have external reviewers that we pay to help be part of that process. And as I shared that thought, like these stories are really impactful because they really give me insight into stories that I otherwise wouldn't. And one of the reviewers was like, with all due respect, I don't really care about your learning. I want to see these films because it reflects me, it reflects my life, people around me, my community. It makes sense of our world, and it's there for me to see on the big screen. And the conversation we had after that was that it can be both of those things, and often is. And I think that's really the power of documentary.
For sure. I'm learning so much about Kartemquin and the impact, particularly about the impact that you all have had through the years. And, under your leadership, you've been at the organization for how many years now?
No, it's just been from December 21, so just about a year and a half.
Okay. So what's your vision for Kartemquin, like on the other side of the pandemic?
Yeah. I love this question because it was the reason that I actually came to Kartemquin. So the Kartemquin, like many organizations, prior to what happened with the murder of George Floyd, was really on a path to interrogate, what was our future. And there was a reflection period and process that the organization had undertaken. And the question came out of that, both how do we support filmmakers who have not found their place at Kartemquin, and also how do we occupy space within independent documentary to look at issues of equity, racial and otherwise, and access. And from that reflection period came a commitment to a reparations framework and look at equity more broadly, and to answer some of the questions that filmmakers in our broader community had asked of, like, how does one get to make a film with Kartemquin? What's the path in? And then, who gets to tell the story? And so the vision for Kartemquin is to take this really storied past, a history of more than 75 films who have told really important stories, sometimes very much on the cutting edge, often very much on the cutting edge, and setting the tone for future stories, and really looking at, who has the right to tell that story? What will it take to make sure that story is told? Like what type of support, financial and otherwise, do we have to make available? Where do we open up access to filmmakers who have, historically been denied access for whatever reason? And then, what does reparations look like in the independent documentary space, and for Kartemquin specifically, when it comes to, opening up internships, opening up even the review panels I talked about. So there's sort of several commitments that came out of that reflection period, and which is the vision for Kartemquin going forward. And that is, how do we support and really feed the ecosystem in the Midwest? So many filmmakers and people who are involved in media in general often have to leave the Midwest in order to make a career. There's rich stories, not only in Chicago, but in Detroit and Cleveland and Columbus and St. Louis and cities across the Midwest. There's an incredible amount of talent, and we need to make sure that we're continuing to support that. I think the other thing is,
So I was going to ask you, how do you see Kartemquin's work and how it impacts the public narrative?
I think, and I think others have seen that documentary tells stories that need to be told for the purpose of understanding issues in deeper and more nuanced ways. And there's so much that happens, at the policy level to make systemic change. There's things that happen at the organizing level, and supporting, somewhere in between, supporting organizers who are trying to make change at a very grassroots level, and systems change at very, sort of legislative and policy levels is the narrative change that goes along with helping people change the way they think about issues. And I think there's no quicker way than to help people first hear a story. We sometimes talk about a good documentary buries the broccoli. You're drawn in from the minute the scene opens because of the compelling nature of this person's own narrative, right? And then before you know it, you're getting deeper and deeper into issues and stories. And you said it earlier, it gives you pause, and it gives you the opportunity to see things from a different light outside of the context of what I would consider more polarizing spaces where the intent is not to bring us together or into deeper understanding.
You mentioned the murder of George Floyd and the civil unrest. How did those events help change the way that Kartemquin does its work?
I'd be hard pressed to say that they helped, but I would say that they galvanized. I think there had been, and I think throughout the time there had been questions around, who has the right to tell a story. Kartemquin has always been well known for, I think, a deep ethical approach to subjects. From the time of Hoop Dreams, which at the time was a very unique approach to storytelling, which now is not so unique, right? But at the time it very much was, all the way through to, Minding the Gap and Unapologetic more recently. I think the question of the reality of George Floyd's murder called all of it into deeper relief and focus, and perhaps gave us all a sense of urgency. I think it happened in the country, right? But I'll tell you this, and I don't want to minimize the impact of the loss of George Floyd's life and what it meant to the work and to the world. But when I first got to Kartemquin and went on a listening tour with filmmakers who had been, made films with Kartemquin, who had been part of its programming, it was really the feedback from those individuals, their truth-telling. And I credit that truth-telling because if you've been historically excluded from access and from resources and from the ability to bring a story to the screen, and you still want to do those things, it's really hard to speak truth to power because you could potentially narrow your options. And so, people were legitimately honest and frank about, we've appreciated what Kartemquin has done. When we've had access, we've felt supported, and, we don't have the wealth and resources that other filmmakers might have that come in. It's not clear how we access the resources and expertise that you offer. We want to be able to participate in internships and apprenticeship programs, but we don't have the luxury of working on very limited stipends or in volunteer ways. And so, I don't know, I don't want to minimize the galvanizing moment, which was George Floyd's murder, but the real, I think sometimes courageous but honest, direct feedback from the filmmaking community. And that includes those filmmakers like Steve James and others who themselves were asking, would I make Hoop Dreams today the way I did 30 years ago? I think those are the people that I think, really all of that pushed us into being really committed and intentional about what reparations is going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a start. Like, we've made
Totally.
changes, but we're only starting. It's going to be a forever project, you know?
That's so interesting, because as an organization, there's always work that you have to do on yourself. But I see the civil unrest and George Floyd's murder as this clarion call for urgency, and that we can't put aside the fact that our institutions oftentimes feed a system that is made to isolate and marginalize communities. And to see you all open up the RFP for, you know, documentary film for Asian American and Pacific Islanders, you know, to begin to explore diversity, equity, and inclusion in the documentary space in a way that then gives folks access to, of course, the credibility of Kartemquin's platform, though perhaps their time does not suggest that it. There was always this, and I don't think it's just in media, but there's always this qualifying. What qualifies you to stand in this space? What qualifies you to occupy this stage? You haven't been in this long enough. You don't have this experience. But how does one gather that if that's the mindset of those who occupy those spaces? So it sounds like you all have opened the door for a much broader approach, not only in grant making and filmmaking, but in creating access for communities who have stories that we haven't heard.
That's
like,
right.
Can you share more about the thinking behind? Because I don't think that that was coincidental. I think you have to be intentional in how you do that, and then once you begin, how do you sustain it?
Yep. Well, again, I would like to, you know, I do want to call the staff of Kartemquin, the board of Kartemquin, before I got there, started this process, and their intentionality is what has, I think, ultimately helped us continue to sustain that. It's memorialized in documents. It's, you know, memorialized in commitments. But I think your point, which I think is a really important one for us to hold space for, is too often what is deemed experienced enough, quality enough, you know, the right to be in a particular space negates the value and the importance and what should be commensable. Like, you should be compensating people for this other expertise that's often overlooked, like the firsthand experience and lived experience of a particular topic. What we're also trying to do is right size that. It is important for you to know how to hold a camera and to edit and to get the you know, the shot right. And it's also important that you can speak from firsthand experience, that you have legitimate representation across your crew, not only from that particular community, but from the issue more broadly. So, you know, when we opened our pipeline up, which again, with transparency, there's, you know, one door to come into partnership with us. The questions that we ask now do ask those questions. What's your relationship to the Midwest and Midwest storytelling? What's your relationship to the story? Are you the person to tell it, and why? What is your representation on the crew? And again, not just, you know, this is a story about an Asian woman, XYZ, and so I have an Asian director. But as you look at that issue more broadly, is there representation from the disability community in your crew? You're not going to necessarily have full representation, but we want people to interrogate those questions as part of the process. And then, you know, what's your communication and transparency and your thoughtfulness of care around your community? Financial care, care for the trauma, vicarious or direct, the time and labor that goes in. I mean, you know, I am always reminded of what a labor of love independent documentary is. Years and years and years of preparation. And people are doing that on top of 2 or 3 jobs. And so I think that those questions are intended to put us in right relationship with what experience actually means, for example. And to trust that the capability is there. Like, I think that's the other thing that I often see, and not in just documentary, but in lots of spaces, is there's an assumption that there's going to be a lack of quality or a lack of capability because people haven't had previous preparation. And what we find is that it takes very little investment to really have a really pretty phenomenal film, because people come with a great deal of capability. They haven't had the ability to exercise that capability. And the other thing I'll say is it's really important, that it's not just we want to give Jhmira a shot, and now Jhmira's in our network and Jhmira is going to be our, whatever. She's the director we want to work with. But it's about, who does Jhmira know, and how is Jhmira bringing other people in, and how does that network continue to grow?
Yes.
And that's what's going to make a rich ecosystem, and that's what's going to ultimately sustain it. And and then I think it's also helping people. People are, how do I want to say this? People are saying really great sayings these days, like, if you want different stories, get different storytellers. I'm so glad people are saying that out loud. But I want to see, how are we backing that up? If you want different storytellers, and the reality is that most Black and brown storytellers, at least in our network, are people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, then one of the things we do is, when we offer rough cut screenings, we've made a certain number of screenings available, and we pay people to come and get our expertise, which a lot of people are like, that's madness. Why would you pay someone else to come to you to get your expertise? It's because we want to make sure that there's space for the filmmaker who can't just automatically take off work, or doesn't have the financial resources to be funding their film already, And those aren't easy. It's not easy to do that. Like, we have to readjust our business model, how we fund ourselves. And that's what I feel like my role is, right? It's like, my role is to make sure people who say they love Kartemquin films, or they love documentary, and they really appreciate when they get to see these other films, it's like, here's what that costs, and not just here's what that costs, but I think too often we forget to remind people, here's the liberation, and here's the great thing that comes when we do that. Because a film like Minding the Gap has done more for mental health and young men in the Asian community than probably PSAs across the country, right?
Sure.
I mean, so
I love all of this, because it sounds like there's a significant emphasis on impact, and not just being able to check off that you're staying true to your mission, but you're tracking and monitoring, how do you deliver impact. And there's a great deal of risk taking in that process. A 57-year legacy is not something that of course came overnight. And there are, I'm sure, many lessons that you all have learned, and even growing to this point. But being able to create access to resources in an equitable fashion, and go through the trial and error of that, I think is very profound, particularly in a cancel culture. Like, can you talk about, like, what the risk taking, what that process was like?
Yeah. Well, some of the risk taking, again, happened before I got there. But right before I was hired, the organization had its Empowering Truth annual benefit, right? And it was a virtual event, and I had been given the offer, but it hadn't been, inked.
Ink hasn't dried.
And so I went to the event. No one knew me. It was virtual, so no one saw me. But, like, I was just watching, and I really wanted to understand, like, what's happening in this space. And in the middle of the program was, and keep in mind, this was a pre-recorded program because it was all virtual. In the middle of the program was a panel with all BIPOC filmmakers, cinematographers, directors of photography, etc., and Steve James. And one of the filmmakers said, Steve, would you make Hoop Dreams today the way you did back then? And, Steve said, you can't ask me questions, I'm the moderator. But he was joking around. He then engaged in a conversation about that. And it was difficult, and it was real, and it was a really good conversation that needed to happen, and no one shied away from it. And so that was like, okay, there's risk taking, but there's willingness to show up. And I thought they didn't have to put that in it was pre-recorded. They could have taken it out. That's one thing. I don't know if if I should, well, I'm going to just be courageous enough to say it. Kartemquin went out on a limb, said that it was going to do all this reparations framework, and then they hired a white executive director. They had a lot of people asking questions about that, and that was another piece and a moment for me, but it was, as I was being hired and people were interrogating that move, I wanted to see what and how the board and others would move. And the board and others' response was, sit down and we'll talk about it, not put out a statement and, hide behind that. And I say this because I don't think there is a roadmap for a lot of this stuff. We just have to, we get to, have open, somewhat scary conversations, but they're conversations that, again, they seem risky, but there's such liberation at the other end, because what I took from that experience is, no matter how we get challenged, if we have a misstep, if we have to shuffle back and admit that we didn't do the right thing, it's going to be okay. And that's how you hopefully, that's hopefully how you move forward.
For sure. I appreciate what you said about not releasing a statement and hiding behind it, because we saw a lot of that throughout the civil unrest. And while I appreciate the sentiment, I would have appreciated more seeing the impact and the many of the deliverables met, through what folks put in their statements about what they would do as a response, or to show their allegiance to any particular community. One of the things that I'm learning about Kartemquin is that you all for sure release statements all the time, but you do it through and by your actions. And to be able to hire, to your point, a white director who's going to carry out this focus, I think there's something to be said about, who all needs to be involved in the solution. A lot of times as Black leaders, we're oftentimes kind of handed the struggle and, left to try to figure it out with minimal resources and such. But to recognize that whatever the problem is, it's all our problem. We share in it, and everyone's lens is necessary. So when we first connected, I forget how you asked, but instead of us approaching this, hi, I'm Jhmira, hi, I'm Betsy, and just kind of trading off our resume, you wanted to know more about my story and how I arrived at Public Narrative and what I was interested in and where I came from. And you too shared more about yourself. So it brought this measure of vulnerability and transparency to what we've been building as a relationship as colleagues, that signified to me that you were genuine in your approach. And it made me, frankly, pay closer attention to Kartemquin, much closer attention than I have since being at Public Narrative. But it made me pay closer attention because I want to understand, how does Betsy see it? How does Betsy see the future of Kartemquin? And what is it going to take to get there? And what part can other storytellers across the city and across the region play in it, helping to advance that vision?
It's a good question. I do want to say this too, that in hiring a white executive director, I do see that oftentimes what my opportunity is to push in the same way that a lot of the staff have, but in a way without the trauma that a lot of the Black and brown staff have carried, both institutionally and industry-wide and just in the world. And that's not to say that my Black and brown colleagues don't show up. They show up every day. But there's a role for me in pushing things forward and speaking to people that not only that whose ear I have in a lot of different spaces, but who might be able to hear it from me in a way that doesn't require the tax that it does on the Black and brown. I still have the same desire for change, but it's not impacting me at the same level to have to push people and to be like, really, do I have to tell you this? Do I have to explain this to you? That's one thing. The other thing though is like, it is the other part of Kartemquin is it's very much is a shared leadership, and we now have the first African American who is occupying the role of an artistic director for Kartemquin. Our founder of 80 years is now moved into a senior advisor role, and so that's another way that we're continuing to build that commitment. But there's also a person of color in the director of marketing. There's a person of color in the director of finance. There's a person of color who leads our filmmaking programs. There's a person of color who's leading our filmmaker funds. It's not only that people of color have a role at Kartemquin. All of our colleagues are committed to and have to live out those values. But I think the same way we want to see the Midwestern ecosystem for filmmakers, the leadership component is also really important. And so, what I and the artistic director are both really committed to is it's not a tour of the Betsy show and the Amir George show. It's Whitney Spencer, it's Yvette Flojo, it's Isabel Martin, it's Haiti Souffrant. They're out at film festivals. We want them to have speaking engagements. We want them to show up. And so part of this also, and you asked like, what can other people in the media and narrative and larger community space do is recognize when you're asking for someone to speak. Too often it's like, I want the executive director of that organization. I want to do the article about the new artistic director. Yes, and I don't want to be part of a landscape that's only Jhmira and Betsy. Like, I love you, and I've really appreciated getting to know you, and I know that there's a wealth of people around you. And so, like, it is very much a web building exercise. And I think whether you're in philanthropy, whether you're in policy change, whether you're a nonprofit doing social service or direct service, or you're doing work in media, like, all of us, I think, have this opportunity to not wait for for politics and everything else to catch up, but to create these spaces where we can have these honest, somewhat difficult, sometimes challenging, not easy, risky conversations.
For sure.
Because if we don't break that.
For sure. It sounds like you all turn that question on yourselves, the same as you might ask a documenter, like, who is best to tell this story?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's incredible. You come with a lot of experience. You, as you shared, you're a transplant to Chicago. And so what influences, inspiration, like, who are some of the people that help shape your experience that allows you to even sit in this seat?
Well, I would say recently, so, one thing that was clear, Jhmira, in my former role, in sort of the nonprofit direct service space, I have had real understanding that space in many ways was built for white women. I found a place of belonging in that space. I found a place of opportunity. Doors opened for me. And it wasn't because I was brighter or more talented or better positioned. The space was built for me. I knew how to move in that space, and those things got rewarded and compensated, and so that's been a big influence. And the people who've influenced me in that space, again, are often the staff and colleagues who just had enough care and concern and bravery to tell me, to just speak that to me. Yeah. And that's one thing. So I have some colleagues that I worked with, who spoke directly to that, and I'm really grateful for those folks. I also, told you that when I was at Heartland Alliance and I got the privilege of being close to people whose stories I otherwise wouldn't hear, the people who influence me are the people who are struggling without being housed, people who are dealing with mental health issues and addictions issues and are turning to sex work to take care of their families, and who day in and day out are struggling in ways that I will never have to in my lifetime. And they influence me because there is no amount of determination, bootstraps, or anything else that is going to change those situations. if we are not changing systems and structures, you know. So those are the people who are in my mind. But there's one person I just want to call into this space, and his name is Keith. He passed away during the pandemic. He was a person who was formerly homeless and was on the board at my old organization. And at one point we were talking, and he said, you know, when I was homeless and I lived on the street, I was on the street for a whole week and not one person looked me in the eye. And that level of invisibility just really stuck with me. But then he said something really powerful. He said, you know, so just, you don't have to give money, you don't have to do anything, just look the next person in the eye. And he said, and don't do it because you expect to get anything from them. They could spit on you, they could yell at you, they could ignore you, they could be angry with you. That's not the point. When you look them in the eye, you restore yourself to your own humanity. And that really stuck with me. You know, what are we actually doing to make sure every day we get up and we're connecting to our own humanity first, so we can extend it outward.
Absolutely.
So I always think about Keith, and he's always with me.
Yeah. You're incredible, Betsy. Like, thank you for these stories and these anecdotes. You over the last 3 years, I will say I've had to really combat exhaustion and burnout in a way that I did not, frankly, sign up for. But knowing that it's necessary, like, how do you preserve your energy so that you have a long life in this work and you're able to contribute at your greatest capacity?